a seismic or a fire. Speak up! Speak up. We've got the 3 exits here, one at the back over there, and one here. Okay. Oh, that's better. Thank you. Today, we'll speak. We'll speak first. Yep. And then there'll be time for questions afterwards. So if anybody has a question, wait till he is finished, and then we'll do the question. Now, it is also my pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor William Harper. He's our guest speaker and express how fortunate we are that he has chosen to come to New Zealand and give us an address. William is a physicist, and for many years he held the chair of physics at Princeton University in New York State. Few figures in modern history have straddled the worlds of pure science, defense strategy, and public policy as boldly as William. His academic roots lie deep in Princeton, with a career spanning 6 decades. He has been a member of the Ailey Jason Science Advisory Group to the US government, and part of that group's tenure was the examination and impact on climate from rising atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide. Professor Harper's own stance diverged sharply from the mainstream climate science, arguing that fears of a catastrophic warming were grossly overstated. He, in partnership with William van Wijngaarden, challenged alarmist narratives by calculating the doubling of carbon dioxide would yield a very modest warming, well below catastrophic levels, but have the wonderful offset of improving plant growth and the greening of the earth. Will's career is a study of intellectual courage. He has consistently defied consensus in climate issues, and his colleagues have hailed him as the truth teller. His conviction is that climate policy should rest in physics and not fear. Now with that, it's my pleasure to invite William, a living legend, to speak to us.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I've had a wonderful few days already in New Zealand. It's a storied place that I wasn't sure I would see before I died, but I've seen it now, so I'm looking forward to more excitement. So I'm talking today, since I'm in New Zealand where there are a lot of agricultural people and it's an important part of the economy.
Can you use the mic, please?
Yes. Oh yes, let me turn on the, good point. I promised to turn this on and I forgot. Can you hear me now? It is okay. All right, let's try this again. Okay, is that okay? Can you hear me?
Try again.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Microphone there.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Let's try it now. So, the focus of this talk is going to be on cattle, greenhouse gases, and climate. And I can summarize it very simply, so you don't have to listen to the talk. This is what I'm going to tell you, which is that cattle which emit the greenhouse gas methane, methane is a carbon with 4 hydrogens stuck to it, and carbon dioxide, a carbon with 2 oxygens stuck to it, have almost no effect on climate. That's the bottom line. They do cause a little warming, but it's not enough to worry about. And just to give you a feeling for how small the effect is, you know, I read all about these goals in New Zealand, to reduce methane, you poison the cows by feeding them this junk that keeps them from, burping methane. And why be so modest? Let's force the world to kill every cow in the world. There are 1.5 billion cows in the world, one for every 6 people roughly. And if you kill them all, then they won't emit any methane, no methane whatever, not this tiny bit that the New Zealand government wants to eliminate. Killing all the cattle would only cool the earth by 0.07 degrees centigrade. You can't measure that, air conditioning will trip on and off until it's 10 times more than this. So this makes no sense whatever. And I might mention that this is not the first fanatical attack on cattle, that this has been going on for as long as humans have been around. I was surprised to learn this, but it's true. And here's an earlier example. And this is the great Xhosa cattle killing that occurred in 1856 and 1857. And it was driven by this young woman, Lunga Busi, who was thought to be a prophetess. She could speak directly to God, and God told her that if you killed all of the cattle in South Africa, that would fix all of the problems that the Xhosa nation faced. The white settlers would be driven into the sea, the cattle diseases that were a problem then would disappear, and people believed her. And so hundreds of thousands of cattle were slaughtered in South Africa. 80,000 Xhosa people died of starvation, and the entire economy collapsed. It really hasn't fully recovered today, 100 years later, more than 100 years later. And this young woman was about the same age as Greta Thunberg. All right, so. And when you look at the basis for net zero and all of the other stuff that goes with this hysteria, it doesn't have any more scientific basis than her predictions here. And I'll explain in some detail why that's so. So, okay, the talk will be only 2 parts. The first part, I want to review a little bit of biochemistry, and I'm sure many of you who are involved in agriculture know more than I do about this, but some may not. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about radiation transfer physics, which is the key to the greenhouse effect, alleged climate change and stuff like that due to human emissions of methane or carbon dioxide. And then we'll take questions at the end. Thank you. So, here's an academic picture of a cow. And the wonderful thing about a cow compared to almost any other animal is that it's able to digest cellulose, fibrous parts of the feed. We can't do that. A little bit of fiber is good in our diet, but we don't get any energy from it. But the cow gets a lot of energy from fiber that gets converted into milk or meat and cheese later, leather. And the cow is able to do this magical trick because its rumen, this enormous first stomach, is full of microbes, microorganisms that are able to break down cellulose. It's hard to break down cellulose, and I'll give you a little feeling for why that is in the next transparency or two. But because of these microbes, the cow gets a lot of energy from cellulose, but one price you have to pay is that in the process of running these chemical factories to break down fiber for food for the cow, you have to release methane and you have to release CO2. And so to be a good cow and to put on a lot of weight, you can't avoid emitting methane. This carbon with 4 hydrogens stuck to it. And methane is a greenhouse gas, so methane will warm the earth. but not very much. And so something that people forget too often is the ancient wisdom that the dose is the poison. Anything in large dose is a poison, and that's true of methane. You know, if the room were full of methane, we would all suffocate. But the amounts released by cows don't matter. So it's way below the threshold for the dose being dangerous. Let's see. So photosynthesis is what sustains most life on Earth. There are a few exceptions. For example, at the dark depths of the oceans where there are vents, hot water coming up from the crust, organisms can thrive by chemosynthesis in pitch dark, but that's a very tiny fraction of life on Earth. So most of life on Earth gets its energy, food, by having plants combine carbon dioxide from the air with water from the soil and using energy from sunlight to make sugar. And then the sugar is subsequently processed into more complicated organic compounds, amino acids, bases, or DNA, and a whole slew of other things. But the first thing that's produced is sugar. And so here is a little summary of how that works. If you look inside of a cell of a green leaf, you will see chloroplasts, which give the green color. And the chloroplast is a little factory, in the mission of the first factory inside this chloroplast is to strip hydrogen from water. So with the aid of sunlight, energy from sunlight, the chloroplast tears off the hydrogen, throws away the oxygen, so oxygen is a waste product, but it's good for us, we like oxygen. And it sends this hydrogen that it has stripped from the water over to a second factory that manufactures sugar. And in addition to this load of hydrogen that gets transported to the second factory, there's a load of energy to run the factory. You can think of these little chemical batteries that are charged up with sunlight and are used to run this cycle here. So this is called the dark cycle. This you need light, you don't need light for this. So this works at deep ocean vents in the same way, but deep ocean vents don't have chloroplasts. And so what this cycle does is to stick three CO2s together, in effect, and make a 3-carbon sugar, the simplest sugars you can imagine. And because there are 3 carbons, this is called the C3 photosynthetic cycle. That's where the 3 comes in, and the C for carbon. So there's a lot of wonderful lore about all of this that's been carefully worked out for the last half century or more. And we understand photosynthesis pretty well, and there are variants of this that are interesting we may touch on toward the end of the talk. Now, that 3-carbon sugar, it doesn't stay 3-carbon very long. Most of it is converted to glucose, which is a 6-carbon sugar. You can count the carbons. They're labeled here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And glucose is most of the time curled around into a ring, but 1% or so of the glucose on average is a straight molecule like this, where the ring has opened up. And when this ring closes to form a ring again, it can close in 2 ways. And if it closes with this OH at this position below the plane of the ring, that's called alpha glucose. But it can also close with this OH above the plane of the ring, that's called beta glucose. There are 2 possibilities of closing this ring. And in chemical equilibrium, about 1/3 of the glucose is alpha, about 2/3 is beta, and a tiny fraction, a percent or less, is this open chain straight glucose. And either of these is fine for us. We have no problem, digesting either alpha glucose or beta glucose. The problem is that both of these are polymerized, but they're polymerized in different ways. So the alpha glucose is stuck together by plants and by our own bodies to make long polymers. And these polymers are easy. Once you form them, you can break them up again and use the glucose for energy to think with, to work your muscles. And the polymers are things like starch in plants, or glycogen in your liver, you know, which is a polymer like this. Our life depends on digesting these, getting our energy from these. But in the plant, more than half of the glucose is actually not turned into alpha glucose, it's turned into a polymer of beta glucose, which is cellulose. So you can see cellulose, it looks almost the same as the digestible sugar, but it's sufficiently different that when you link beta glucoses together, you make an extremely strong chain, and it's almost impossible to break this back into monomers that we can digest. And that's why, you know, you can eat all the fiber you like, you won't gain any weight. But a cow can eat fiber and gain weight from this because of the microorganisms in its rumen that can break this apart. But the microorganisms are forced to do this in such a way that they release methane. They can't do it without releasing methane. Or if you poison them, they'll release hydrogen, but that's not a good idea. And so you can sort of see what the chemical engineering, the basic chemical engineering is that the elements of sugar are a carbon, an OH, and an H. They're strung together. I showed a case where there's 6 of them strung together, but there can be 3 or there can be 5. You know, there are all sorts of sugars out there in the world. But if you want to break this down without oxygen, and inside the gut of the cow there's no oxygen, the rumen is devoid of oxygen, you would suffocate there. So the result of breaking this down to get the maximum energy is called fermentation as opposed to respiration. There's no oxygen involved. The best you can do is to turn this into 1 molecule of methane and 1 molecule of CO2. You can't get around this fact. That maximizes the energy you can get from fermentation. And that's carried out by a complicated zoo of microorganisms in the rumen. And it includes bacteria and their cousins, the archaea, the fungi, even protozoans in there. And we should be grateful that cows have figured out how to do this. And if you really look at the history of life on Earth, probably dinosaurs did it too. You know, the dinosaurs ate a lot of vegetation, and there's no way they could have gotten enough food, energy from the vegetation they ate, which is very fibrous, without having similar gut flora. So this has been around for a long, long time. Let's see. So that's the reason for all of the attacks on cattle. So the supposed scientific reason is the emission of methane, which is a greenhouse gas which warms the earth. And so supposedly we've got to stop all emissions of methane, CO2, any other greenhouse gas to save the planet. But none of the people who are demanding that we do this understand any of the basic physics involved. Much less economics. Just to give one example, you know, in my country, before the Europeans came, there were enormous herds of buffalo in the Great Plains, and there are probably at least as many buffalo as there are cattle today. And the buffalo ate a very fibrous diet. They didn't have silage, they didn't have grain, you know, and so they probably emitted more methane per animal than modern cattle, beef cattle in this case. And so we're talking about eliminating emissions of methane that have gone on as long as the world's existed, you know. Why all of a sudden is this a threat to life on Earth? It isn't a threat to life on Earth. It's always been that. And the reason it's not a threat is it almost doesn't matter in terms of warming. So we're getting close to where I'll have to talk a little bit about physics. So now I'm going to talk about physics and the atmosphere and global warming from greenhouse gases. And the first thing you have to remember is when you're talking about warming, you're talking about temperatures. That's what you measure. You measure a temperature. And there isn't a single temperature for the Earth. You know, where we're sitting here today, I would guess it's around, 20 degrees outside, something centigrade. But if you go up, it rapidly cools down. I was interested driving down. We looked out the window of the car and I saw Mount Ruapahi, or what, I've probably mispronounced it, but you know, this lovely volcanic cone with the snow on the very top. And the reason for the snow on the top is this cooling that as you go up, the atmosphere rapidly cools. Near the surface, it's around 6.5 degrees per kilometer. So on top of the volcanic mountain, that's 20 degrees cooler. So it's close to freezing, you know. And you can't avoid that because of the way the atmosphere works. That happens because the air below 10 kilometers, certainly up to the height of the volcano, is churning up and down and up and down, and the expansion as the air goes up cools it down. It has to do work against the atmosphere, so it has to cool. So don't forget that when people talk about temperature, you also ask you, which temperature are you talking about? Usually it's implied that they're talking about the temperature of the surface, but it's not obvious that that's the most important temperature. Now let's talk about the greenhouse effect. And Earth, that comfortable temperature out there of 20 degrees Celsius is the result of a balance between us being heated this afternoon. The sun is shining down, and you go out and you feel your skin getting hot from the sun, and that heats the surface and everything that it is absorbed by. And if there were nothing to get rid of that heat from the sun, the surface would get hotter and hotter and hotter, and soon everything would melt or burn up, and but that clearly doesn't happen. So why doesn't the Earth overheat? The reason is that anything warm, we ourselves, our own body, the warm Earth out there, emits radiation to space. And if the atmosphere were free of greenhouse gases, the only thing that would be able to emit radiation to space would be the warm surface, the dirt, the surface of the oceans, and they would send off beams of thermal radiation, which is much longer wavelength than sunlight. You can't see this, but you feel it if it's intense enough. But in fact, the atmosphere is a little more complicated. It's not completely transparent. It's full of gases like methane, CO2, and most importantly, water vapor and clouds that make it impossible for most radiation to get all the way to space. So the radiation might start here at the surface, it gets that high, and then it gets absorbed by a greenhouse gas molecule, a methane or a water. That's the end of it. It's destroyed. And then at that same altitude, one of those greenhouse molecules may suddenly just take heat and convert it into radiation and send some more radiation to space. So the actual atmosphere works quite a bit less efficiently in transferring heat. You can see that with all these bumps and reverse paths and everything, heat won't get out as efficiently with greenhouse gases as if there were no greenhouse gases. So the effect of all of these zigzaggy paths due to the greenhouse gases causes the Earth to be warmer than it would. It's like putting a blanket over yourself at night to stay a little warmer. It slows the heat escape from your body. All right, so that's the basic idea. So it's really true that greenhouse gases form the Earth. There's no question about that. And let's talk about how much. You know, remember dose, it's the dose that makes the poison. And to do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of physics, the physics associated with radiation transport, you know, with global warming, and that is closely associated with these two German physicists of the turn of the last century, around the year 1900, 1910. the guy up here is Max Planck, and Max Planck is certainly one of my heroes. I would put him up there with Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein and Galileo. He was an amazing guy. And what he is most famous for was that he solved a nasty secret that most people didn't realize, but the secret was that classical physics didn't work. And it was known in classical physics that if you calculated how much energy a warm body would send off to space, say, that for very low frequencies, so I'm plotting frequency this way, the energy increases very rapidly with frequencies, but it never stops. So in classical physics, this curve that starts shooting up, shoots up faster and faster and faster. No one liked to put that on a graph because it was too embarrassing, and it obviously didn't happen. But Planck took this seriously. He said, we really can't live with this. What's the matter? And what the answer turned out to be was that radiation had to be quantized. And so this was the birth of quantum mechanics. So what we're talking about today, greenhouse gases, it goes right to the beginning of modern physics. It was what led to modern physics. People, when they think about modern physics, they think about particle accelerators sometimes, or atomic bombs, or radioactivity. No, it was because of radiation transfer. So as a result of quantization, Planck was able to show that instead of this curve going up in an infinite way, it would turn over and fall off. And so that the total energy, which would be the area under this blue curve, would be constant. So this blue curve is called the Planck curve. And but if you actually look at radiation coming from the Earth, from other things, it never looks exactly like the blue curve. So the radiation coming out of a warm body in almost all cases is less than the Planck estimate, although not very much less. For example, on the Earth, the area, the Planck energy coming up without greenhouse gases would be 394 watts per square meter. Because of the greenhouse gases, it's somewhat less. This is about 70% of this. So there's still a lot of radiation going up, but not as much as you would expect, and that's all because of greenhouse gases. And you can see here the most important greenhouse gases I've labeled. This area, water vapor is suppressing the cooling radiation to space. This area, CO2 is suppressing cooling radiation to space. This is ozone, way up in the stratosphere, 20, 30 kilometers high. Here's more water at these frequencies. Methane you can hardly see. We'll look at this in more detail, but methane contributes, nitrous oxide contributes. The takeaway message, and perhaps this is the most important takeaway message of this afternoon, is that for CO2 and for methane, as I'll show in a minute, further increases of the concentrations almost don't make any difference. So this jagged removal of cooling radiation is due to the CO2 that's in the air today. If we double that CO2 from 400 parts per billion to 800 parts per billion, that curve would change to this red line, but you can hardly see the difference between the red line and the black line. And the radiation to space from doubling CO2 goes from 277 to 274, just 3 watts per square centimeter, 1% roughly. So think about that for a minute. 100% increase of CO2, the demon gas, only causes 1% decrease in the cooling to space. And it's very easy to make up that with a small increase in temperature. It turns out that a 0.25% increase in temperature will restore balance and keep the Earth from overheating. On the other hand, if you took all the CO2 away, you would go to this green curve. So the point I'm making that is that the effects of CO2 going from none at all to what it is today has done just about all the damage it can do. And if you double it, it hardly makes a difference. And so a qualitative way to explain that. I won't try to derive it, I guess, is, the atmosphere, you can think of the atmosphere as like a coat of paint on the earth. And so, for example, if you want a nice red barn, you can put a coat of red paint on there. And if you decide, well, I'm really going to do it right, maybe one coat isn't enough. I'll put a second coat. I'll double the CO2, right? If you put a second coat, it doesn't make any difference. It looks just as red. And so you're wasting your time. And that's the situation we're in now with most greenhouse gases. They're like good paint that has already made it the same, as colored as you can get it. And adding more won't make any difference. I think most people intuitively realize that this is what would happen with paint. And it also happens with greenhouse gases. So the technical term for this is saturation. So the effects of greenhouse gases are saturated. I hate to use that word because it's used in so many different senses in different parts of science, but in radiation transfer, what I've just described is called saturation. It's not the same as a saturated solution of sugar or saturated absorption spectroscopy or something like that, but it's a big effect. And now you might ask, why should anyone believe these calculations that I showed? And by the way, the jagged lines are something that Carl Schwarzschild showed how to calculate. So Schwarzschild was an astronomer, astrophysicist, and Planck was a physicist, and so they had a little different views on Earth. But Schwarzschild knew very well that if you look at the sun and stars, you don't see this smooth spectrum. You saw lots of jags in it. And in the case of looking at the sun, these would be called Fraunhofer lines. There may be some people here who took some physics and remember that. And so Schwarzschild showed how to calculate this jagged line. It's called the basic equation we still use today, called the Schwarzschild equation. And let me say a word or two about the personalities here. Max Planck, besides the genius in inventing quantum mechanics, was one of the most admirable people in Germany during the Nazi era. He refused to join the Nazi party. His son was executed by the Nazis for supposedly being involved in a plot to kill Hitler. So he had a very sad life. He had two sons. The first was killed in World War I. The second was executed by the Nazis. And Karl Schwarzschild died in World War I too. He was on the Russian front. He had some kind of bad autoimmune disease. Maybe he was a celiac, I don't know. There was something wrong with him, but he got no medical care, and so he died of his own disease. It's really very sad, because sitting there in the trenches facing the Russians, he was the first one to solve Einstein's general theory of relativity in an analytic way in some cases, and he corresponded with Einstein, from the muddy trenches of the Russian front. Quite a guy. Anyway, these curves are calculated with the Schwarzschild equation, the person I just pointed out. And if you compare what you calculate with what you measure, you can measure the radiation coming from the Earth by looking down from satellites. You can't tell the difference between what you calculated and what you measure. So here is a calculation of radiation coming up from the Sahara Desert. And notice the vertical scale. These are different vertical scales here. So the Sahara Desert, there's a lot of radiation, 200 units coming up here. And the dashed line is the Planck curve that I mentioned, and the jagged line is the Schwarzschild curve, these two people I talked about. And here's what you observe. You observe the same thing. This is carbon dioxide, this is ozone, this is water over here. Go over to the Mediterranean, it's cooler, so the top of the scale is not 200, it's 150. But it's very similar. what you calculate is what you measure. You can hardly tell the difference. But if you go over Antarctica, it's quite interesting. Over Antarctica, the real radiation coming up from space is actually greater than the Planck prediction. And that's because during the winter in Antarctica, where I'm showing here, the ice surface is much colder than the air above. So it's like a frosty morning or a frosty night that lasts for 6 months. It's dark for a long time over Antarctica. And during that time, the air is much warmer than the surface. And so that's because of the greenhouse. This is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide over Antarctica is an anti-greenhouse gas. It makes the earth cool a lot faster than it would if it weren't there at all. So there are lots of subtleties here that most people are unaware of, but it makes it very difficult to do a very precise calculation of what's going to happen in the future. So let's talk about how much changes in flux, how much temperature change results from a change in flux. And the key equation here is the flux goes as the fourth power of the temperature, and some correction factors here. And again, this is a very famous equation, and it's associated with two names. And the first one on the top here is Joseph Stefan, who worked at the University of Vienna from 1850 to around 1900. And he was a Slovenian physicist, and he's the only Slovenian physicist I've ever heard of, but he was a good one. And he was also quite a good Slovenian poet, and I've read some of his poems in translation, they're very good. But he was such a good experimentalist, he was able to show experimentally that the flux had to go as the fourth power of the temperature. This absolute temperature. This, by the way, to a physicist, this was, unbelievable. How could it be such a high power of the temperature? Most things are proportional to the temperature, or maybe to the temperature squared, but this is the fourth power. So this was very surprising when he announced this, but it was clear he had done his experiments right and they were correct. But he had another talent besides being an outstanding experimentalist. He could judge people well. And so a younger version of Ludwig Boltzmann showed up at his office in Vienna and said, I need a thesis sponsor, can you give me something to work on? And Stefan talked to this young man for a little while, and it was clear he was bright and willing to work hard. And he said, well, why don't you try and give a theoretical explanation for this fourth power here? And, he did. He went away for 2 or 3 months, and it turned out that you could derive this from classical physics, everything except for the constants in front of it. So Boltzmann was able to show that this went as the fourth power, and it came from combining the theory of thermodynamics, which had only recently been fully developed in physics, and the Maxwell's equations for electromagnetic radiation, also very recent. So it's amazing someone that young could have mastered those well enough. There's a little calculus, I won't bore everyone here because most won't be able to follow it anyway, but the point is that a 1% change in flux, say from doubling CO2, only gives you a 0.25% change in temperature. So that 1/4 comes from this fourth power here. And so that means if you calculate how much doubling CO2 would do to the temperature, to first order you get 0.71 centigrade, not even 1 centigrade, less than a centigrade. So the hard physics of this is that greenhouse gases are not very effective in warming the earth. And that was, of course, a big embarrassment for the alarmist establishment. I brought along a CO2 meter. I like to sometimes measure the CO2 concentration. So I'll turn it on. It'll take about 30 seconds. We'll see what the CO2 level in the room is. Before I came in.
How long would it take to double CO2 to create that in the years?
It would take about 200, of the order of 200 years to double CO2. We're increasing at 2.5 parts per million today, per year. And we're at 400 parts per million, 430 or so. We'll measure in a minute. But when we came in, on the outside there, we measured, I think, around 420, oops. This is on now, and you can hear it squeaking. And that means it thinks the CO2 levels in this room are unhealthy. And we can have a little pool here. Who would like to guess what the CO2 levels in the room? I know because I can read the meter. Any guesses?
190. 190.
180? Okay. Any other guesses?
1,000.
Okay, these are all good guesses, but I'll show you the answer is 2424. 2,400. 2,000. So the amount in the room here is 6 times what it is outside. And the reason is that we enemies of the planet are sitting in here breathing. You know, we should stop breathing. Okay. So that's Stefan and Boltzmann. So let's talk a little bit about methane. Methane is increasing, so these are measurements from NOAA, American agency, and this is the year 2021, and this is the year 2025. And I'd like to stress, when you see a graph as an ordinary citizen, look carefully to see what this scale is, because when people want to worry you and make you think that things are out of control, they will often expand this scale, you know, so it looks like things are changing rapidly with time. But here you see it starts at 189 and the top is 194, so this is just barely a % change. But it's been magnified, so it looks like a huge rate of change. It's not very much. If this increased at this rate, it'd take about 140 years to double the methane concentration in the atmosphere. It's not going to happen probably, but I pointed out it's not. And we talked about the effects of CO2 and saturation. The same thing happens with methane. So the black jagged curve is the Schwarzschild curve we were talking about, and red shows what happens if you double methane. You can hardly tell the difference between the red curve and the black curve for doubling methane. And if you take all the methane out entirely, all you get left is the green curve. And you can see part of this effect is there's some overlap with water, so this further makes it a little harder for methane to make any difference. But methane has very little effect. It reduces radiation to space if you double methane by 0.25%. And so that makes very, very little warming.
So we could have a lot more cattle then.
Yeah.
Double.
Well, let's talk about cows. So this is, you can estimate how much methane in the atmosphere comes from cattle. Because you know the number of cattle per year, they're pretty good world records. You know, dairy associations, they like to know what the competition is out there, how many cattle are there. And so the number has been very, very slowly increasing since this is go from 1985 to 2025. It looks like there might have been a 20 or 30% increase in the number of cattle. And you can take the number of cattle and you can multiply by the methane emissions per year is about 75 kilograms, maybe a little more, and multiply by the lifetime, 12 years. This is a little uncertain, but not bad, and that allows you to make this calculation, what goes into calculation. And you see that of the total methane, which is this red curve up here, which is measured, the amount that you can estimate from cattle is of the order of 1/6, maybe 1/5, something like that. The length of this line is the length of this line. This might be 5 times smaller than this height here. So it's something that's measurable that you can notice. It's not completely negligible, but it's a small effect. Okay, and it makes almost no difference to the temperature of the Earth. Let's see if I can advance this. So if you remove all of that methane from cattle that we just looked at, the 1/5 of the total, 1/6 of the total, by killing all the cattle, just like the HOSA prophetess demanded, but for the whole world, then you only decrease the temperature by 0.07 centigrade, very small amount. This is absurd that anyone would consider this worth paying attention to. In the law, there's something called de minimis, you know. This is way below de minimis. It shouldn't be attracting any attention. It makes you wonder about the sanity of leadership. So this is a problem for the climate alarm establishment, because if doubling CO2, which is the most potent thing you can do, only gives you 0.71 centigrade of warming, and that takes 200 years, you know, that it's hard to get anyone very excited about that. And so what have they done? They said that there are huge positive feedbacks to this direct warming. That everyone agrees, even the IPCC agrees, that this is the warming you get directly. You know, they might say 10% more, but essentially this number. But they claim the warming is not 0.71 degrees for doubling CO2, but it's at least 3 degrees or maybe 4 degrees, and some of the crazier ones say 10 degrees, you know. It's completely absurd. And the basis is this idea of positive feedback, that a little direct effect is hugely multiplied by positive feedback. And, you know, if you're an engineer or a physicist, you scratch your head at that, because that violates a very widely observed property of nature, is that most natural feedbacks are negative, they're not positive. So if climate really did have a positive feedback, which is necessary to support the alarmist narrative, it would be a huge exception. It would violate what's called Le Chatelier's principle, that when you perturb some thermodynamic system, it comes to a new equilibrium in such a way that it counteracts the applied change. It counteracts, it doesn't amplify the applied change, it suppresses the applied change. So if anything, these first order estimates that I showed, 0.7 for double, that's probably too big, but the other side says, no, it's too small by a huge amount. Well, we will soon see what the answer is. It's been one disaster after another for the computer predictions. Nothing has worked, and everything suggests that the greenhouse gases probably have had very little to do with the increase in temperature that we've observed over the last 100 years or so. It is certainly possible that clouds have changed quite a bit, and there's quite strong evidence for that, but there's very little evidence that CO2 or methane has had anything to do with it, or at least not very much. So let me close with a few words about benefits of CO2. We're talking about having poison in this room, all of us sitting here making it 2,500 parts per million, but that's not poisonous at all. That is the level that greenhouse operators like to put into their greenhouses, because plants love high levels of CO2. They grow much faster, and for several reasons. This is an American crop, and maybe some of you recognize it here. I found that it's not grown too often, but anybody know what is this crop? Soybeans. So somebody got the right answer here. This is soybeans, and it's all this is genetically modified soybeans. How do you know? Who knows why it's genetically modified? It's a GMO organism for sure. The reason is there are no weeds. You know, there's this huge field. When I was a kid, before GMO, You know, I remember looking at soybean fields, they were all full of weeds, you know, you couldn't cultivate them properly. But this is a variety of seed that can be sprayed with a herbicide that kills just about any weed, but has no effect on this variety of soybeans. So it's called Roundup Ready seeds. I think Monsanto makes it. But it's interesting stuff. I was telling Jennifer, we were talking about the slide a day or two ago, and I said I used to, out of curiosity, I would dig up the roots of soybeans, and they have huge root nodules. You know, it's a legume, so it makes nitrogen in root nodules, and if you slice through the root nodule, it's big enough to see easily. It's not like clover or about this big. It's bright red. It looks like it's bleeding, and the reason that happens is because all legumes, but especially easy to see in soybeans, produce hemoglobin in their root nodules. And the reason for the hemoglobin is very similar to the cow's ruminants. The hemoglobin is to pump oxygen out of the nodule so that the oxygen does not poison the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the nodule. So it's moving oxygen, but in the opposite direction that we move it. We use hemoglobin to get oxygen to our tissue. This uses hemoglobin to get it out of the tissues. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but they both settled on the same molecule to transport oxygen, a plant and us. So let's talk about why does CO2 provide so many benefits to the world. And you can see the world is greening. That's very clear from satellite images of the Earth. I'll show one example. But the most important reason it's greening is because with more CO2, plants don't need as much water. And if you look around the world, the main problem for agriculture, there are many problems, but the main one is often drought. You know, if you don't get enough water, you won't make a crop. And New Zealand is nice and green, so maybe you don't notice it as much in New Zealand, but certainly in Western Australia you do, Western United States you do. And the way that works is the plant, in order to get the CO2 that we talked about at the beginning for photosynthesis, has to have little holes in the leaves, and so molecules of CO2 diffuse in through this hole, and the plant captures them and converts them to sugar in photosynthesis. But the inside of the leaf is moist and it's full of water, and so for every CO2 molecule that diffuses in, 100 water molecules go out the same hole. And so plants are extremely inefficient in the use of water, but at low levels of CO2 because they have to make the holy leaves with so many openings in them. And when you grow plants with twice as much CO2, plants are not stupid. They grow leaves that have half as many holes in them. And then they don't leak as much water, and they can grow in arid regions where previously you couldn't make a crop. And we see that all over the world. The most dramatic effects of more CO2 are in the arid parts of the world, you know, where there's really not quite enough rainfall to normally make a crop. Let's see. We talked in the beginning about this second factory, the Calvin cycle, where you take hydrogen and CO2 and combine them into sugar with this molecule Rubisco. Rubisco is a protein, and it's an abbreviation for a very long organic chemistry. I'm not sure I can say it. I think it's ribose 1,5-phosphate carboxylase oxygen. It's a long one, it doesn't matter. But this has the this is making sugar. But the Rubisco was invented in the history of evolution, you know, 3.5 million years ago, a long time ago, maybe 4 million years ago. Nobody quite knows for sure because there's not much left of the geological evidence today. But it has a design flaw, and the design flaw is that instead of working only on carbon dioxide to make sugar, if Rubisco can't find enough carbon dioxide, like today, instead of grabbing a CO2 molecule, it'll grab an oxygen molecule from the air and make nasty things like hydrogen peroxide, which are very damaging to the plant. You know, you wouldn't want to be eating hydrogen peroxide either. It's a strong oxidant. So that's a design flaw. So here's this problem I mentioned. So for plants today, if you can't find a CO2 molecule inside your leaf, there's always lots of oxygen from the air, and the oxygen gets combined with the hydrogen, the energy from the first factory I mentioned, and it makes one 3-carbon sugar, but then a second oxidizing compound which gets converted to hydrogen peroxide and other nasty things that cause a lot of damage to the plant. And so this side route called photorespiration suppresses the efficiency of plant growth by about 25%. It's a big effect. And there are a few plants that have gotten around that. These are the C4 plants like corn. I saw a lot of corn growing as we drove down today. Corn has a trick. It isolates this rubisco, the most abundant protein in the world, and protects it from oxygen. So it's in a little fiber bundle where oxygen can't get in. But then it has to pump CO2 in and keep the oxygen out. So it's worth doing that today with low levels of CO2. This is a win for corn. But as you get more and more CO2, it gets harder and harder for corn to compete with non-C4 plants that use this simpler machinery, less costly machinery like wheat, rice, most other grains. The only other major crop that is C4 is sugarcane, and both of those are adapted to low CO2 levels. So here's the greening of the earth. I mentioned most of it is in arid regions, Sahel, Kalahari Desert, Western Australia, Western USA, and Canada, Western India. And this is continuing. There's just no question that the earth is greening and it's due to more CO2. So I'll close here so we have time for some questions. Those of you who have not had a chance to read this book, I would like to recommend that you read this. It was first published in 1840 or thereabouts by Charles Mackay, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And this is just one more example of that, with the climate, hysteria that has gripped so much of the world. I'm hoping that it is finally reached its peak. It certainly reached its peak in my country, in the U.S. It's never going to come back, I don't think. But it's still quite strong. I can see New Zealand, United Kingdom, Germany. But it's a mistake. There is no threat. And so let's hope that it will soon be gone, and hope that it's a long time before there's another crazed, popular delusion that should take its place. So I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now we'll open up for questions. What we'll do is anyone who has a question to put up your hand, we'll bring them the microphone, ask you to stand up, state your name clearly, then ask your question. Right. Now, you happy to
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, hello, my name's Mark Oliver, and yes, I am a farmer. And my question is why are some people, or lots of people, and why are politicians so anti-cattle or anti-ruminants? Why pick on ruminants?
Would you repeat that for me?
Yeah. Why are politicians so why are politicians buying into what you say?
Well, you know, I'm really good at solving differential equations and calibrating instruments, but I've never been much good understanding politicians. And so, yeah, let me say that, to be a little bit serious, many politicians feel that that's a good way to get reelected. You know, the first thing you want to do as a politician is to get elected at the next cycle of elections. And so it was perceived that there was a large green vote out there, and that if you at least gave lip service to saving the planet, who doesn't want to save the planet, that would help to get you reelected. And so I think that perception is gradually fading because, for example, our last big election in the United States, a number of politicians were brazenly contemptuous of the fact that there might be a climate crisis. They denied that there was a crisis. They said it was a hoax, and they got elected anyway. So that was a very interesting message that has stiffened the spines of other politicians who, you know, if you've got any sense, you recognize this is a scam. But you're willing to go along if it will help you get reelected. And so that perception is fading rapidly.
My name is Lockie Harding. I farm down the southern end of the desert road. I just wanted to know if you've got any theories on a lot of talk about the Earth's axis over 5 years.
Could you stand up, please, and state your name?
I am.
Okay. Ready in the microphone.
He's got it.
Yeah. Like that.
Yeah, my name's Lockie Harding. I farm on the desert road. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to know your theory on, there's a lot of talk about the Earth tilts on its axis, 5 degrees over 10,000 years, I'm not too sure what, which sort of, I've been told that, like Antarctica, the climate down there, one part of that 5 or 10,000 years, Dunedin would have that sort of climate, and then vice versa when it goes back the other way. Have you got any theories on that? Or do you know?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Could you come a little bit further forward and ask the question a little more loudly?
Yeah, I think you correctly.
Yeah. Have you got any theories on the Earth tilting on its axis?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I got it now. Thank you. No, that's an excellent question. If you look at the recent history of climate on Earth, we're in an ice age now, and I've been in an ice age since the last 3-4 billion years, a million years, I should say. And nobody quite knows why, but one of the theories is that if the Earth's axis tilts too much, you don't get enough sunlight in the northern hemisphere, or maybe I've got it backwards, to melt the previous winter's ice. I guess if it's not tilted enough, then you tend to get ice ages, because you don't get enough sunlight during the summer to melt last winter's ice. And that as the Earth orbits the sun, its axis, the tilt axis swings up and down from about 23 to 25 or something. It's only a few degrees, but near the poles that has a huge effect on the amount of summer sunshine. And this was first promoted by a Serbian physicist named Milankovitch. And I think it makes a lot of sense myself. It doesn't work sort of automatically, but it's close enough that most people believe that it's probably true. So, and if you take that seriously, I don't think there's any immediate danger for an ice age, on a time scale we're worried about. But if you're worried about your descendants and 10,000 years in the future, they may have a problem again, because you can predict when the tilt changes to that much. I hope that's okay. It's a very rational theory.
The mic isn't working, so if you'd like to come up, anybody that wants to ask questions and yell, so just come on up. Because otherwise I'll have Will running around with room like I did
I'll
last
walk
time.
over
I
here
can
so I
tell you.
can hear you better. I'll have that. Okay, let's figure it out. Well, the mechanism they usually. The question was, what's the basis for the positive feedback that believers, believe is true? And the usual argument is that the little warming of the surface will cause water vapor to increase very dramatically at high altitudes, like at the top of the volcanic mountain we were talking about. And if that happens, indeed, it would be a very strong positive feedback. The problem is that we measure vapor pressure at all altitudes and it's going the wrong way. So the water vapor concentration is actually going down, it's not going up. So the fundamental mechanism that water vapor increases up there doesn't appear to happen. But anyway, that's the main meme, the main story. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Any others? Yeah. Could you stand up, please?
I'm Peter Backus from Thames, and I went to a climate conference. It's not on. Sorry. Is it on? And what I noticed was that the so-called global warming, the graph put up started in 1918, and I thought it matched the use of electricity and particularly the use of radar, which was discovered in 1918, and that graph to me seems to match the suspected global warming exactly, and yet we blame carbon dioxide.
Well, that's a good question, and let me try and respond. Probably the best estimate I know of on how much temperature has changed have been things like the recession of glaciers. And so, for example, in Alaska, glaciers grew until roughly 1750, and they were getting longer and longer, going out into the Pacific. And then they stopped increasing. So, for example, the shore of Alaska was mapped by Captain Vancouver, a great British explorer, in 1790. And his charts are so good, you could sail there using his charts a day. He was really a good navigator. But all of the major glaciers at that time went right out into the Pacific Ocean, Glacier Bay, for example. And within 50 years, by 1850, most of that ice melted away. I'm talking about early 1800s, long before 1900, long before there was any increase in CO2. So the Earth, for some reason, began to warm around 1800. And another piece of evidence supporting that is that if you look at sea level from proxy data, and we've actually got some measurements that go back, sea levels were actually falling until roughly 1800. And then they turned around and it started increasing very slowly, but starting to increase at about the same time as the glaciers started to melt. But these proxy observations don't agree with the idea that it's CO2 at all, because CO2 hadn't done anything by 1800. So what we're seeing is probably mostly some natural recovery from the Little Ice Age. In 1100, the Norse farmers farmed the south of Greenland. They had extensive farms, they grew barley and things that won't grow there today. But you can find the barley grains, in the farmsteads that have been abandoned because it's too cold. And so it was much warmer then than it is today. It's still not as warm as it was when the Norse settled Greenland. And that warming, if you look at the proxy records, it's not very different from what we're seeing today. And you look back over the last 10,000 years, there have been many, warmings like today, and followed by coolings, warmings, coolings. So this is not an unusual warming. It's completely normal, for the last 10,000 years.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Professor. It's been fantastic to hear your presentation. My name is Arthur Dominic, and thank you for explaining the graining. It always confused me when I looked at really older pictures, and this rocky cliff face 200 years ago now has like huge amounts of vegetation and a lot of foliage. So that was the first thing I've actually heard, so I'll make sense of that. So thank you very much. Just kind of moving on to the question, which is, what do you consider as humanity's greatest public scientific achievement?
What is humanity's greatest scientific achievement?
Yeah, what do you consider as humanity's greatest public scientific achievement?
Oh, wow. That's really a profound question. And I can't answer it without offending lots and lots of scientists. So I have to beg it off, since I'm a scientist. Myself, if I answer it, they'll kill me.
Right, I think it's quantum. To be honest.
Yeah.
You've got one, yes. Just wait a second until Deborah brings you the microphone.
Simon Williams from Gisborne. Not only the
Sorry, it's not working very well, I'm sorry, so she'll just talk directly.
not only they claim carbon dioxide with global warming, they also, whenever we have cyclone or lots of raining, they blame on carbon dioxide too.
Yeah. But they does not include the IPCC. They say very clearly, if you read the scientific part instead of the summary for policymakers, that there's no evidence that there's been any change.
No, and then they say, this is true only for tropical places. And then you say, how about deserts? Do they have increased rain? They say, no, the model is not working, but we have to find out why. So they never say the model is wrong. They just say, like, how come the nature doesn't support the model?
Well, thank you. I think you've made a good point, and that is that the IPCC models started coming out in the early 1990s, and I didn't pay a lot of attention, but I looked at the predictions, and none of the predictions have come true. They predicted, for example, the Arctic Ocean would be ice-free in late summer by 2010 or something. I don't remember the date, but about that date. And indeed, the ice in Antarctica decreased until about 2007, and then it hasn't budged since, so there's been no further change. So what, in normal science, you would say, as this question indicated, that there's something wrong with the models don't work. And so, in fact, there's a famous criterion for what is really good science. Good science, a good theory in science is something that's falsifiable. That you can make a prediction of something that has not been observed, and people can go out and see, is this prediction correct, and did this guy get it right? If you can't do that, if the theory can't make any predictions that you can test, then it's not really science, And so that's the person who pushed this was called Karl Popper. He was a philosopher of science from Austria. And I think he spent part of the war here in New Zealand, if I recall, during the Hitler period. He was somewhere here in New Zealand. And so climate science is it doesn't satisfy this falsifiable criteria because it gets falsified again and again, and people continue to buy it. So I don't know why that is. It's a mass delusion, as I said, it's not real science, it's a mass delusion. Yeah, good question, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So you said that it's not about the methane on the layer. What is it then? Like, we can see that it's getting hotter. So if it's not the amount of methane, what is it? What may cause the Earth to get hotter? And alongside with that, I just wanted to ask Mark's question again.
Okay.
Because he actually asked why targeting the cows. There are many options to point out as the cause of the amount of methane or why the Earth is getting hotter, and they point out that it's because of the amount of cows we have in the world. But if you just pointed out that that's not it. So
Yeah, it's not, definitely
it
not
might be.
cows, yeah.
So why they choose targeting cows, not anything else? Why? And so I have two questions, sorry. One's from Mark. Yeah, because he didn't get answer. I think he didn't put very good words. So why targeting cows instead of doing something else or targeting something else?
Well, you know, again, you're pushing me beyond the bounds of my expertise. As I say, I'm good at differential equations. I'm really not very good at understanding people's motives. But if you go back and study the history of this movement, which many people have, it actually goes back much further than you would think. It goes back to the 50s and 60s, and there was an organization called the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome, I think they were basically well-intentioned people, but they looked at the history of humanity, and it was one disaster after another, wars, you know, and the main disasters were usually humans picking on other humans. And so they said, we need something to unite humanity so that we have a common enemy to fight, and we won't fight amongst ourselves. And that was the basic message. And so what could be a better common enemy than saving the planet, you know, from, you know, environmental destruction? There wasn't any evidence in that there was going to be environmental destruction, but they started looking around, what could we choose as a common enemy? And so for some reason they decided to choose greenhouse gases. And I think the main reason at the time was it looked like it was a lot of money, you know, because a huge part of the economy was the energy sector. So it gave them a chance to demonize the energy sector, and I think what they were hoping would happen would be like, you know, banning cigarettes. Cigarettes really are harmful, you know. There's no question that they're harmful, but greenhouse gases are not. But in the case of cigarettes, you can still buy cigarettes, you know. They didn't ban cigarettes, it's just that the governments now take most of the profit from the cigarette companies. So many people expected to take most of the profits from the oil companies, and they would use it to reward their friends and political allies and stuff like that. So I think the old saying, follow the money, is a good one here. Where was most of the money? Most of the money was in the energy sector. So, but again, I'm not an expert on this. I'd be happy to talk to you about a differential equation. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Haber. I'm Martin Gibson from Tauranga. This might be beyond your expertise as well, but I listened to your...
Just hold your microphone.
I don't think it's working.
Yeah, it is.
I listened to your Leighton Smith interview, and said you managed a $10 billion military budget. I just wondered if you had any knowledge or opinion on HAARP and what effect beaming, 3.6 megawatts of energy into the atmosphere has. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And HAARP is a research program that we had in Alaska for many years. As far as I know, it's not doing very much today. But as you say, it had very intense radio transmitters up near Fairbanks that irradiated the ionosphere. And the reason we were doing that was at that time in the United States we used shortwave communication, around the world. That's how we communicated. It was before satellites. And so, that is strongly affected by the state of the ionosphere. So it was a way to artificially change the ionosphere and see what happened to, high frequency radio communication. And I don't think it made very much difference to the environment. It did teach us a little bit about the ionosphere, not as much as we'd hoped to learn. But then once satellite communications came in, people began to lose interest in it anyway because, you could get only narrow bandwidths and you had to keep tuning all night, to keep up with the changes in the ionosphere. So, my own view is it didn't make much difference. Yeah.
Jeremy Horrocks, retired from Napier. Very nice to catch up with you, Will. I also heard the podcast with Lathan Smith. Getting back to the actual animal itself, the cow. With the process that the cow goes through, obviously we're getting the methane discharged. A great deal of money has been spent on reducing the methane, and I understand recently that in, I think Denmark, but certainly in Europe, that they are forcing people who've got cows to have the cows take some substance, and it's causing a great deal of problems. I'm just wondering if you could maybe know a little bit about that, and it could be detrimental to the whole of the cycle of the actual animal itself, let alone the meat it produces.
I understand the question. Let me try and say a few words about it. And so we'll put the cow cartoon back if we can find it. So in this zoo of microorganisms that is in the rumen of the cow, different microorganisms do different things. If there's no oxygen, the bacteria, the fungi are able to break up the cellulose. But in that process, instead of making methane, they make hydrogen. So the cow's rumen is full of hydrogen, not methane, as a result of the first stages of this fermentation. But hydrogen can provide even more energy to the cow. It can give it more sugars, more proteins, if you can combine the hydrogen with CO2 to make methane. So sort of the topping cycle of this fermentation factory is the combination of hydrogen to CO2. And to make methane, that's the maximum energy you can get out, if you don't have oxygen. If you had oxygen, you would burn the methane or you would burn the hydrogen, biologically burn, but you don't have the oxygen in the room. So these additives are designed to kill the top stage microorganisms. They're typically archaea, this oddball bacteria-like microorganisms that does this conversion here. And so the cow, it's true, it's unable to make any methane because you kill the microorganisms that make that methane. But at the same time, it's lost that energy that it would have gotten if it had done the final step of combining hydrogen to CO2. So the treated cows are burping hydrogen, and you lit a match, I guess you'd get a hydrogen flame, I'm not sure. But most of the basic process is usually you kill off that part of the microflora that combines the hydrogen to CO2 to make methane. And it's a bad idea. Why would you cut into the efficiency of the cow? This has evolved over millions of years. It probably, as I mentioned, was used by the dinosaurs with much the same microorganisms. Termites use similar organisms.
Thank you. Oh, yes, sir. Yep. Me.
Hi, I'm Sam Plummer.
I just want to re-ask a question in different wording. I think we all accept that the climate is changing. I think we all understand that there is global warming. Sorry, there is climate change.
Well, I would say that I agree that it started warming in 1800.
Yes. So there is a cycle of global warming.
Yeah.
As a beef breeder's son, I'm relieved that it's not ruminants that is responsible for that. But I'm wondering what you think is responsible for that. Is it the natural cycle, or is it something else that's been going on since 1800?
Okay, that's a good question. What is really driving the warming cycle we have now? And I'm telling you now what's really a guess, because many of the other things I've really done very carefully, and I no doubt that they're right. But as for what's really causing the warming, my guess is it's changing in cloud cover. Because, for example, if you look at the records in Europe, Poland, Holland, over the last 50 years of warming, there have been substantial increase of cloud-free days. So they're getting more sunshine in Northern Europe than they did in 1940 and 1950. And that's, coincident with this stage of warming. And it's pretty obvious if you get less sunshine on the ground, it's not going to get as hot. So, for what it's worth, I think it's probably mostly changes in cloud cover. But it's seldom that anything in science like this has a single answer. Usually there are a number of factors involved, but I think clouds are the most important.
Do you have an explanation for why there might be a change in cloud cover?
Well, I don't know what happened in the year 1800, but certainly after 1945, it's easy to see that cloud cover should have decreased because they stopped burning high sulfur coal. So, I was a kid in 1948 in Edinburgh, and I'd go to school and my shirt would be black with, coal slips when I'd come home at the end of the day. You look up, you never saw the blue sky. I was very surprised to come to America and find the sky was blue. It was great. And so that, if I go back, the sky's blue again. And so I think at least for the last 50 years, it's been the suppression of particulates from coal burning. It's a likely suspect. But what happened in 1800, I don't know, because probably then cloud cover was also decreasing. But there wasn't enough coal burning to finger that as the cause. So the sad thing about all this is this manic focus on greenhouse gases has probably set back real understanding of climate by at least 50 years, because we've had a whole generation of scientists who've been forbidden to consider any alternative explanation except the CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, which are almost certainly not very important. They're not zero, but they're just not very important.
I can have a couple more, Alan?
This gentleman and then we'll get.
Thank you, Professor. It was very reassuring what you've been telling us. Yet it is undeniable, I think, that climate change is a fact of life. I'm a very old man. I'm 96.
Well, that's encouraging.
I've lived a long time, and I've seen the world change during my lifetime quite considerably. For example, in the early days in the Taupo area, I used to go hunting for deer. And on a frosty morning, we would walk across the dusty forest roads, and the soil would have lifted about that much, and every step we took, we actually set in. Now, this kind of frost we have not seen for the last 30 or 40 years. So, every year, new temperature records are set, all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes New Zealand and Australia. In Australia, people now think that it will become impossible in their lifetime to continue living there, because once you get to 40 degrees or so, humidity can't stand it anymore. You have to leave. So climate change is undeniable, I think. The argument is what causes it.
Well, would you like me to respond, or would you want to say some more? Well, first of all, I agree that climate change is undeniable. I hope I made that clear during the talk, that climate has been warming. I think that it's very unlikely that it will warm more than, another 1 degree or so. It's warming about 1/10 of a degree per decade, so.
No, we're not talking about a 10th of a degree per decade. We're talking about a degree, an order of the degree practically every year.
No, that's completely false. That's simply not true. Not true. We have the best records, in my view, are the satellite records, where you look down at the microwave radiation coming up from the atmosphere, and you can build very good systems that measure that very precisely. That gives about 1/10 of a degree per decade. And it's been that since about 1980. So it's now it's 2025. So for 45 years, it's been a 1/10 of a degree per decade.
We don't live up there, we live here.
Well, that's true, but I showed you this temperature lapse rate, and that lapse rate is 6.5 degrees roughly per kilometer. And so if you measure at that if you measure at 1 kilometer, then if you add 6.5 degrees, that tells you what the temperature is.
Well, that is assuming that the gradient stays constant.
Well, we've got every day there's thousands of radio songs launched, by weathermen to measure the temperature of the atmosphere versus altitude. And if you look at them, they all give 6.5 degrees per kilometer at low levels. And so I don't think there's much doubt about that. If you try to measure things on the ground, it's really a nightmare, because there are all sorts of systematic problems. Stations come and they go, you've got heat island effects from growth of suburbs around the measuring stations, so it's very, very difficult to calibrate that network. And I don't think anyone really takes it seriously.
When airplanes fly around at 30 or 40,000 feet, the temperatures they encounter are very low.
It's roughly minus 50 C, that's right. Well, that's exactly what you get if you multiply 6.5 by 10 kilometers or whatever it is, and you get, the temperature of the Taupo.
Yeah, we need to move on. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, my name is Alan Trotter, and you know it.
Yes, we corresponded, right?
We had 6.5 years.
Yeah.
I've got a huge dilemma in the New Zealand context. You've educated, dare I say it, 90%, maybe more, of 60-year-olds or more in this room today. Or you've reinforced a point of view. We've got an education curriculum that says our 9-year-olds to 14-year-olds have to be taught exactly the opposite to what you are professing. We're sunk. We're in a dilemma because we're going to go and all these kids are going to grow up with the wrong idea. What's the truth?
Well, let me try and encourage you a little bit more about kids. I think there are always some very trusting kids that will swallow this. But there, in every generation of kids, there are bright ones who are quite suspicious of the narrative they're given when they're growing up. And that's most clearly, I think, the most clear example I can think of that is the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, for generations, they got even worse propaganda than our poor kids do today about climate. You know, it's all this crap about Marxism, Leninism, you know, the father of nations, Stalin. And you had to do that, you know. The consequences of not doing that were much worse than doubting that there's a climate emergency. And yet the whole system collapsed in 1990 because the bright kids who went through there never believed it. They had absolutely no illusions that it was all phony. And since they were bright, they controlled Soviet society. And they finally said, why are we doing this? You know, we're destroying our fellow citizens, and let's call it quits and become and jump communism. And the less perceptive members were outraged by this, you know, and so it was a bitter 10 years until finally they were reconciled that everything they had been taught was a lie, but they eventually were. And so I wouldn't worry too much about the kids. I think the bright kids will recognize this is nonsense and eventually will rally around and we'll get rid of it. That's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union.
I sincerely thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Yes.
We have one more, last question.
I'm not sure if this is even a question. I'm not I don't dislike cows. I don't dislike cows. I grew up in Kenya. My dad was a vet and looking after the Maasai cows, and so I'm a friend of cows. I can't speak for all the farmers in here, but I've heard that the palm kernel importation into New Zealand has increased recently, and so we're increasing, human beings, spreading out, and so there's a sort of pushing, everything's pushing on everything else, which is what happens in this sort of situation of a big population of any animal.
Right.
And you know, you were talking about clouds, and 1800s was a time of mass cutting down of forests for shipping in Europe. So that's not the whole of the Industrial Revolution per se. And the landslides and the flooding and the vulnerability of people at the moment to storms and stuff is also because they've cut down too many trees, or they've not protected their slopes properly. And so I think, yes, I feel, now I just want to say that, you know, the thing against the cow was definitely increased by the palm kernel thing. And, you know, that Indonesia, so anyway, the forest has been cut down on behalf of the cow.
Okay, well, I don't think that palm oil is that important in livestock raising, but yeah, perhaps I'm wrong, but let me also say one other thing, because you raised an interesting point about the growth of population, human population, and I'm willing to put my neck out and say the real problem in 50 years will be just the opposite, will be the shrinking of human population, because as the rest of the world becomes prosperous, like Europe and America, New Zealand, Australia, what always happens is the birth rate falls below replacement. And so if you look all around the world, even China, you know, China is population decreasing. America would be decreasing if we didn't have massive immigration. And So I think that, thinking for the future is how do we persuade the human race to continue to, you know, reproduce itself, you know. So make, you know, one thing that forbidding people from having fossil fuels is you keep these poor people barefoot and pregnant, and then the population continues to increase. But is that really a good reason to ban fossil fuels? You know, of course not. Yeah.
Thank you, Will, and we'll put a close to the questions, and I've asked Deborah Alexander to pass a vote of thanks to Will.
Hi everybody, I'm representing the Methane Science Accord and Groundswell that have sponsored Will here today. It's been a big venture and we are just so blessed to have him with us. I followed this since 2019 when I wasn't sure whether the answer was there was a climate emergency or not, and I'm a scientist. So I went back to the basics, and at that time it was only CO2, and after a lot of research I realised it wasn't. CO2 was not an issue. If you actually, the saturation argument is perfect for CO2. And then they came out and added methane, and I thought, you know, that's even less, that's a tenth of CO2. And so that's when I started joining organisations like Federated Farmers, a political party, and got very involved with the New Zealand Climate Science Coalition and then the Methane Science Accord. And I learned about, I'd been reading up on Will Happer. To actually have somebody of his calibre here is absolutely amazing. And so Groundswell and Methane Science put the funds together to do it. So there's a small donation box if you've got any money to help, that would be fabulous. And I would really like a round of applause for Will.
Well, let me applaud you too. You know, there's this ancient saying that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for enough good men to do nothing, good men and women too. And every one of you, I know, is trying to do the best they can to do good things for the environment, good things for society, and thank you for what you're doing too.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Well, if you don't mind, I've been trying to work out what would be an appropriate, very brief summing up that hopefully resonates with what he has said this afternoon. And the calculation that I've done is this. You take a pocket of air with 83,333 molecules in it. Anybody know how many carbon dioxide molecules are in that amount? Just 33. But it gets worse. Out of that 33, how many are put up by nature? How many are put up by mankind?
0.004.
No. 32 are put up by nature. All the burning of fossil fuels and everything else in the world, there's only one molecule out of that big pocket of air that is generated by us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.